I'd like to talk about the use of outliers in batch at a glance. Outliers is a tremendously productive feature because it allows you to set limits on your samples and the compounds in that samples and discover quickly whether there's an issue in terms of the limits that are set. So as an overview, the outliers that we have 20-something outliers set up for you. Only certain ones are turned on by default. You've already run into the fact that we have given you accuracy, which applies to the calibration samples and QCs. We also warn you if a sample is quantitated outside of the calibration range, meaning the lowest and highest level that's active. In the results section, we have several outliers, including the integration metric, which we have talked about in the integrator section. Also, the integrator metric is applied to the qualifier. Another section that's turned on by default is retention time. So we tell you if the peak is wandering from the expected retention time or the expected relative retention time from the ISTD. And last, the qualifier ratio is an outlier which is turned on by default. There are also other outliers which are not turned on, and I'll show you in a moment how to set limits for them and make them active, but we cover areas of metrics associated with the calibration curve, like the average response factor, the curve fit R squared, relative response factor. And also to monitor your samples, we can flag up sample amounts, limit of detection, limit of quantitation, signal to noise. And also with other sample type groups, we can monitor an ISTD response, blank concentration. If you're using matrix spikes, the matrix spike percent difference, matrix spike percent recovery. Same for the surrogate, and surrogate percent recovery. And then if you're running a response check sample, make sure that that shows a decent response. So the grayed out outliers here are turned off by default, and if your standard operating procedure requires some of these metrics, it would be useful for you to turn them on. And I'll show you. Let me look here at the method editor. The outlier setup tasks are here on the Explorer bar, and I'd like to focus in on the retention time and the relative retention time. So let's see how these are set up. I look at the retention time. I can see for methamphetamine here, there's the transition, that the expectation of where that peak appears is 10% of the expected. I can, if it's within that, then it's within the limits. I can also give it an absolute limit of minutes, but I'll stick with percent here. Also, I have the capability of doing relative retention time, which is, again, a percent argument, percent deviation of the relative retention time max. Let me stick with the retention time, and I'll go back to the sample. While that's happening, let me discuss the calculations involved in making retention time outliers. If I look at the help, I'll see that there are equations that describe the retention time outliers as well as all of the other outliers. For example, the relative retention time calculations are shown here. So I should be able to figure out how those calculations are being made from the documentation. So going back to batch at a glance, with that particular sample 1, I'll see that the retention time for methamphetamine, the outlier is pointing out it's outside of that particular window, the 10% variation that I expected. And let me convince you that that's true by looking at the graphics. So I'll show the graphics in a little bit more detail here, and I'll compare the retention time of the peak that was discovered, as you can see, matching up against the ISTD below, at about a little above 2.2 minutes. That would be the expected. This target peak has been found quite off that retention time. And if I go up one sample to compare it, you can see that here's a much stronger signal where the retention time is a bit above 2.2 in the ISTD. The deuterated compound matches that quite well, where the signal that I was looking at, which has violated the outlier, detected as an outlier, shows the target peak here. So that's the usefulness of outliers, specifically showing you retention time and relative retention. Let me introduce you to the outlier toolbar, which is sitting up here. First, I'll be able to see the outliers that are turned on by default that I showed you in the introduction here. I'll also show you the capability of filtering. You can see I have the drugs of abuse batch here, and I've got several different kinds of outliers. The accuracies are showing up low because they haven't adjusted the calibration curve. We just talked about the retention time of the methamphetamine being high. So looking at all the compounds in this batch, if I click here on this flag, I'll get all the high and low outliers that have been turned on. As I can see here on the left, you get the warnings from the outlier flags for each sample by hovering over that particular icon. Now also I have the capability of just getting the high outliers, or potentially just seeing the low outliers, or I could see the samples which have no outliers. So the push buttons on the outlier toolbar give me control of filtering the samples, and I think that you can appreciate how that can help you zoom in on samples so that you can get your analysis done faster. Let's take a look at the sample here, sample 1. Now, if I look at methamphetamine, look carefully at the ISTD, methamphetamine deuterated compound, I'll see that I've gotten an ISTD response that's quite low. I go over and look at the strength of that signal, you'll see that it's quite low. So what I want to do next is go over to the method editor and adjust an ISTD outlier to help me. Now, I will give myself a little bit of room here and then expand the outlier section. Right here is the ISTD response. So zeroing in on the ISTD response, I've got two columns that are involved here, the methamphetamine. Here's the methamphetamine deuterated ISTD. And I've got the ISTD response limit low and the ISTD response limit high. So from a limit sake, I'm going to say the ISTD response must be at least 500. On the high side, I'm going to want to have the outlier detect any signal that's above 3,000 and tell me. So now that I've got my method set up with an ISTD response outlier for the methamphetamine deuterated compound, I will next apply this method and then reanalyze. Now that I have reanalyzed with the new method that contains the outlier turned on and the metrics set, you'll notice that for this particular sample here, I'm being told now that the ISTD response is too low for those limits. And also, as I go up to calibration level 1, I'll notice that also that particular sample gave an ISTD response that's slightly larger than the
expected 3,000 limit. So that gives you an expectation of how to use outliers to zoom in on problem samples and help you get through analyzing a large batch. Thank you for your attention.